Tessa Okafor, was standing at my kitchen counter in a paint-splattered flannel shirt with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched yet, and I was trying very hard to act like I hadn't memorized exactly how she looked when she was nervous. She had this thing she did when something was eating at her. She'd go quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet we'd built over 3 years of living 4 doors apart in the same walk-up on Palmerston Avenue. This was the kind of quiet that had weight to it. The kind that made the November wind outside sound louder than it was. Her photography show opened in 6 hours. Her ex had called that morning to say he wasn't coming. She hadn't cried. She'd shown up at my door with an empty mug and said, "Do you still have that good Earl Grey?" And I'd said yes before I'd even fully opened the door, because that was how most things worked with us. I poured the kettle water and didn't ask about Preston, because she'd tell me when she was ready, and pushing her was like trying to rush a developing photograph. You just ruined it. The gallery was called Meridian, and it was on Queen West, one of those repurposed Victorian buildings that still had the original tin ceiling, if you remembered to look up. Tessa had been working toward this show for 2 years. Not a group show, not a student showcase. Her name on the wall outside, her work filling every room, her vision arranged in a specific sequence that told a story she'd been trying to figure out how to say for most of her adult life. The series was called What We Carry. Portraits of people in the moments just after something heavy. A woman sitting in a moving truck with the door still open. A man in a hospital corridor, reading a text message. A teenager at a kitchen table, with report cards spread out in front of her, and her hands pressed flat like she was steadying herself. Tessa had spent 18 months finding these people, earning their trust, and pressing the shutter at exactly the right second. She'd told Preston about it on their first date. I know because she told me about it after. The way she told me most things. She said he'd nodded and said it sounded interesting and changed the subject to a series on Netflix he was watching. She'd ignored that instinct and spent 11 months trying to make it work anyway. I could have said something at the time. I didn't. Because it wasn't my call, and because she needed to get there herself, and because some part of me knew that what I wanted to say had nothing to do with being a good friend. She finally took a sip of the tea, set the mug down, looked out the window at the street where someone was walking a dog the size of a small horse through the slush. He said he has a thing, she said. What kind of thing? A work thing in Mississauga. I didn't say anything. On a Friday night, she added. In November, I said. She looked at me then, just for a second. Yeah. I picked up my mug. Okay, I'll drive. You're already coming. I know. I just wanted to say it out loud so it counted. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. But she let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since she walked through my door, and that felt like enough. Tessa had lived on Palmerston for a year before we really talked. I'd seen her in the hallway, coming and going, always with a camera bag on one shoulder, and a slightly distracted look, like she was composing a frame in her head, while doing something else entirely. We'd done the neighborly nod for 11 months. Then one Saturday morning, the radiator in her apartment stopped working and it was -18 outside, and she knocked on my door at 7 a.m., holding a blanket around her shoulders like a cape, and said, I know this is a lot. Is there any chance you have a space heater? I had 2. She stayed for coffee while she waited for her landlord to call back. We talked for 3 hours. She missed her first appointment. I forgot I'd planned to go grocery shopping. By the time she left, I'd agreed to look at her portfolio for a grant application, even though I was a structural engineer and had no idea what made a photography grant compelling. I gave her feedback anyway. She got the grant. After that, it felt like we'd always known each other. We called ourselves friends because it was the honest thing to say. It covered everything, without asking anything extra of either of us. she borrowed my parking spot when she had early shoots downtown. I texted her when I needed a second opinion on something I couldn't quite see clearly. Because Tessa had a specific talent for cutting through the noise and saying the one thing you already knew, but needed to hear from someone else. We had a standing Thursday dinner that had never once been formally scheduled. It just happened. Every week, one of us cooked, the other brought something from the LCBO, and we sat at whoever's kitchen table and talked about everything and nothing until one of us had to be somewhere else. Preston had joined those dinners for a while. He was fine. That was genuinely the word for him. Fine. He laughed at the right moments and had opinions about craft beer and wasn't unkind. He just never quite paid attention in a way that felt real. He listened to Tessa the way people scroll, present enough to catch the headlines, not present enough to read anything through. I had noticed things about her that Preston had not, in 11 months of being her boyfriend, seemed to notice once. That she pressed her thumbnail into her forefinger when she was anxious, and if you watched for it, you could always tell before she said anything. That she used humor as a delay tactic when she was scared. And, if you waited through the joke, the real thing was always right underneath it. That she'd been awake for most of the last 72 hours, editing the sequence for the show, and hadn't eaten enough, and that she was running on caffeine and nerves, and the very specific adrenaline of someone who had put something true into the world, and was now terrified about what it would do there. I noticed all of that. I had just never figured out the right way to explain why. We got to Meridian an hour before opening. The gallery coordinator, a woman named Bex with very short hair and paint under one fingernail from what looked like an unrelated project, met us at the door with a tablet and a look on her face that meant something was already wrong. "Okay," Bex said. "Good that you're early." Tessa stopped walking. Worst thing first. Bex looked at her tablet. The 3 prints in the third room. The Sudbury sequence. What about them? They were hung in reverse order. Tessa went very still. I knew what that meant. The Sudbury sequence was the emotional center of the entire show. 3 portraits of the same man, her uncle, who'd been laid off from the nickel mine and spent 6 months figuring out who he was without the job that had defined him for 20 years. The order mattered. It was the whole point. First you saw the weight. Then you saw him sitting with it. Then you saw him putting it down. If they were reversed, the story ran backwards, and the whole sequence became something else. How long to rehang them? I asked Bex. She looked at me. 20 minutes if we move now. Then move now, Tessa said, already walking. I followed them into the third room. The prints were large, 2 feet by 3, framed in simple black aluminum that Tessa had spent a week researching, because the frames needed to disappear around the image. I held the first one level, while Bex confirmed the hardware placement. Tessa stood back and told us exactly where to shift, a 1/4 inch left, 1/2 inch up, until each print sat precisely where she needed it. She didn't touch the frames herself. She'd explained to me once that after a certain point in the process, her hands on the work made her second-guess things she'd already settled. So she stood back and directed. And I moved what needed to be moved, and Bex rehung the third print on the first try. Because Tessa gave instructions the way she did most things, with enough clarity that you understood not just what she needed but why. When the last one was up, she looked at the sequence for a long time without saying anything. "There," I said, but quietly because the room felt like it required that. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Yeah, that's it." Something shifted in her shoulders. Not much. Enough. "Okay," Bex said, checking her watch. 45 minutes. I need to brief the front desk. You two good? Tessa said yes. Bex left. The third room was small and still. The 3 portraits of Tessa's uncle looked out at us from the white wall. And in that order, in that light, they were quietly devastating. The man in the first frame looked like someone holding something too heavy, In the second, he just looked tired. In the third, his face had that particular quality of a person who has finally set something down and is figuring out what his hands are for now. I'd seen these images dozens of times on Tessa's laptop, in various stages, but seeing them printed at this scale in a real room felt different. I said. "These are really good," I said. "Don't," she said. "Don't what? Don't be kind to me right now. I'll fall apart." "I'm not being kind, I'm being accurate." She looked at the portraits instead of me. Her thumbnail was pressing into her forefinger. I could see it from where I stood. "I'm terrified," she said. It came out simple and flat, like a thing she'd been carrying that she was finally putting down somewhere safe. "I know. What if it doesn't land? It already lands. I just watched it land on you, and you've seen these 1,000 times." She didn't say anything. "You can be scared and still have done the thing right," I said. "Those aren't the same problem." She finally turned to look at me. There was something in her face that I didn't know how to categorize. The way she sometimes looked at me when I said a thing she hadn't expected but recognized. It lasted about 3 seconds. Then Bex called something from the front of the gallery, and Tessa closed whatever that was and walked toward the door. And I followed her because that was what I was here to do. The guests started arriving at 7. By 7:15 the gallery was holding that particular energy of a well-attended opening. Warm bodies, low music, the clink of wine glasses, people standing in front of images and saying things that meant they were actually looking. Tessa became someone else when the room filled. Not fake, sharpened. She had this way of moving through a crowd that made it look effortless, touching a shoulder here, laughing at the right second, steering a conversation away from a topic that would have eaten 15 minutes and redirected it towards something that mattered. I'd seen her do it at smaller things. Tonight it was turned all the way up. I stayed close enough to be useful, and far enough not to need managing. I topped up a wine glass for an older man who seemed confused about where the server had gone. I found the extra programs that Bex had left in the back storage room and brought them to the front table because the stack was running low. I spent 6 minutes talking to a city councilor who wanted to corner Tessa about a grant program, and I told him she'd be thrilled to connect after the opening, and took his card and put it in my jacket pocket where it would either get to her or not, depending on whether he was actually useful. Every few minutes I caught Tessa across the room. She was doing her job, and she was good at it. But I knew her well enough to read the signs. Her wine glass wasn't moving. She kept brushing her right hand against her hip, the flannel shirt gone now, replaced by a dark blue dress that she'd described as the least terrifying option in my closet. When she stood still, her posture was too controlled. I found her near the back of the second room, pretending to check something on her phone. "You're white-knuckling it," I said. She didn't look up. "That's not a medical term. It is for you. I'm fine. You've looked at that phone screen for 40 seconds without doing anything." She put the phone in her bag. "I hate that you notice things." "No, you don't." She was quiet for a second. Then softer, "No, I don't." The room got smaller, not uncomfortably, just the way it sometimes did between us, when we stopped doing the thing where we kept one foot on safe ground at all times. Then someone behind me said, "Tessa." I knew before. I turned. Preston stood just inside the doorway of the second room in a gray wool coat that probably cost $400 at some shop on Ossington. He was handsome in a way that photographed well and meant very little in person. He had the relaxed expression of someone who'd arrived exactly when he chose to and expected that to be fine. "I thought you had a thing," Tessa said. "Not sharp, just careful." "Got moved," he said. His eyes moved from her to me, then back. "Didn't realize you already had company." "This is Reed," Tessa said. I offered my hand. "Raid Calloway." Preston shook it the way people shook hands when they wanted you to know they were doing you a favor. "The neighbor, right, that's one way to put it," I said. "Preston," Tessa said. and her voice had the particular evenness of someone choosing their words very carefully. I need to check on the second room's lighting before the photographer comes through. Excuse us. She didn't wait. She touched my sleeve and walked, and I followed. Because that was what you did. She took us through a side door into the service corridor behind the gallery. White walls, bare bulb, 2 folding chairs that nobody was using. The door clicked shut, and she leaned against the wall and let herself exhale like she'd been holding it since he walked in. He said he had a thing, she said. I know, in Mississauga. I remember. So either the thing moved or he wanted to see if I'd notice he didn't come. She paused. Both options tell me something. I didn't say anything because she was figuring it out, and she didn't need me to do it for her. I'm not upset that he's here, she said. I'm upset because I'm not upset enough, and that tells me something too. She looked at me. There was something loosened of herself, she maintained all evening, was temporarily offline. You're not still carrying him, I said. You're not still carrying him. That's not the same as not caring. Her eyes moved over my face in that way she sometimes had, like she was composing something. Why are you always the person who knows what to say? She said quietly. I've had time to study the subject. She almost smiled. Then the service door opened and Bex stuck her head in with the expression of someone who deeply regretted the interruption. So sorry. The Toronto Arts Council rep is asking for you. And the photographer from the grid is here for the portrait session. Tessa straightened. 5 minutes. Bex nodded and disappeared. Tessa looked at me. I'm going to need you out there. I'm already out there. She pushed off the wall, stopped with her hand on the door, turned back. Raid? Yeah. She looked at me with something I recognized, but couldn't quite name out loud, the way you sometimes knew a word in another language, but couldn't immediately translate it. Don't go anywhere, she said. I'll be the one who looks like he belongs here but definitely doesn't. You belong here, she said. And she said it the way she said things she actually meant, without any performance around it. Then she opened the door and walked back into the gallery. I stood in the corridor for about 3 seconds longer than I needed to. Then I followed her. The next hour passed the way complicated evenings do. In pieces. I found the Arts Council rep and told him Tessa would come to him in 12 minutes, which gave me enough time to find Tessa and tell her he was near the Sudbury of her uncle and probably susceptible to the story of her occult. She went to him with everything turned on and left him looking genuinely moved. I watched from across the room and didn't try to take credit for the setup. The photographer from the grid wanted a portrait of Tessa in front of her own work, which she hated with a specific artistic revulsion she'd explained to me twice. She did it anyway, because Bex asked nicely, and because the grid had a readership in the mid-100,000s and this was not the moment for aesthetic convictions. Preston circulated. I watched him the way you watch weather you're not particularly worried about, but don't want to be surprised by. He talked to people he knew, laughed at things, held his wine ease. He glanced at Tessa sometimes. She didn't look. Around 8:30, I found Tessa in the first room, standing alone in front of the image that opened the show. It was a photograph she'd taken at the Bloor GO station at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning. A woman in a transit uniform, sitting on a bench, with her eyes closed, and both hands loose in her lap. Just for a moment, between one part of her day and the next. Tessa had stood 60 feet away with a long lens and waited 11 minutes for that moment. It was the quietest image in the show and in some ways the most devastating. You look like you're seeing it for the first time, I said. I always see it for the first time when it's on a wall instead of a screen. I stood beside her. The room was emptying slightly as people moved toward the wine table. I have something I need to say, she said. Okay. Not here, okay? She looked at me sidelong. Stop being so agreeable. It makes it harder. Makes what harder? She turned to look at me directly. Whatever she was about to say, she'd been carrying it for a while. I could tell by the way she'd already arrived at it, past the hesitation, settled into the fact of it. I keep pretending, she said slowly, that what we are is just the easiest version of what we are. I looked at her. And tonight, I fixed the prints, and you held them level, and didn't once ask me to explain why the order mattered. You just held them level, until I said they were right. She paused. And that's been true of everything, for 3 years. I didn't say anything, because I was afraid that if I said the wrong thing, I would lose whatever was being handed to me right now. I think I've been doing what Preston does, she said. Except in reverse. He never paid attention. I've been paying attention and pretending I wasn't. Or that the attention was just neighborly. That's a very specific word, I said. I know. She almost smiled. Then she said, quieter, I'm tired of using it. The room was nearly empty. The image of the woman at the GO station looked out at both of us. Tell me to say something, I said. Say something. I've known since the morning you showed up at my door with a blanket and an empty mug. I said. I just didn't think it was my move to make. Her breath caught. Small. She covered it by looking back at the photograph. Why wasn't it, she said. Because you were figuring something out. And rushing you would have been like trying to rush a developing photograph, she said. I looked at her. Yeah, a beat passed. That's a thing I actually say, she said. I know. I've been listening. She turned toward me again. Her eyes were steady in a way that meant the professional version of herself had gone entirely offline, and it was just her now. Exactly her. The person I knew from Thursday dinners, and GO station parking lots and 7 a.m. conversations that lasted until noon. Preston's going to leave soon, she said. I can tell by how he's holding his glass. Okay, and when he does, I don't want to feel relieved and then immediately change the subject and let tonight become just another night I didn't say the thing. What do you want instead? I asked. She looked at me with something open and unhurried, like she'd been waiting for me to ask that exact question. I want tonight to be the night I said it, she said. From across the gallery, Bex called her name. A donor group. 2 seconds. Tessa held my gaze for one more moment. Don't disappear. I'll be in the first room, I said. Looking at the photograph you took at 6:15 on a Wednesday morning. She gave me the real smile then. The one she only used when she wasn't thinking about it. Then she turned and walked toward Bex and the donors, and I went back to the first room, and I stood in front of the photograph of the woman at the GO station, and tried very hard to make my pulse behave. Preston left about 20 minutes later. I saw him from across the main room. He looked at Tessa once from across the space. She didn't notice, because she was in the middle of a conversation about the Sudbury sequence, and she was actually present in it. He finished his wine, set the glass down on a passing tray, and left without saying goodbye to anyone in particular. I watched him go, and felt nothing except a mild, uncomplicated relief. The last guests filtered out just before 10. The gallery went from full to quiet to still in about 15 minutes, the way events always did, and then it was just us, and Bex, and one caterer packing up the last of the wine glasses, and the photographs on the walls looking out at the empty room. Bex appeared with her tablet, a tired but solid expression on her face. Good numbers on the prints, she said. 3 sold, 2 inquiries that looked serious. Arts Council rep stayed till 9:45, which means he liked it. She looked at Tessa. You did well. Tessa nodded once. She was still in the mode where she processed things quietly before they landed. Bex looked at me. And you talked that counselor into leaving early, which I saw and which saved everyone about 40 minutes. He was very interested in the grant program. He's always very interested in the grant program. He does nothing about it. She pointed between us with her stylus. I'm leaving before either of you say anything that makes me have to process emotions after 10 p.m. I'm 34. I need 8 hours. Tessa smiled. Thank you, Bex. Thank me by sending me the name of that film lab you used for the Sudbury prints. I have a client who's been asking. She was already heading for the back. Lock up when you go. Alarm code is on the door frame. And then she was gone. The gallery was quiet. The kind of quiet that feels earned. Tessa slipped off her shoes. She set them beside the bench in the first room and stood in her socks, on the hardwood floor, and for a second, she looked exactly like the person I'd met at 7 in the morning in a blanket, before 3 years of everything that had happened between then and now. There she is, I said. She didn't answer right away. She looked around the room at her own work. The image at the GO station. The portrait of a man sitting in a kitchen the morning after his mother's funeral. The photograph of a young woman on a bus, asleep against the window, something small and peaceful in her face that didn't match the exhaustion everywhere else. It's real, she said. When I'm in it, I forget that it's real. It's very real, I said. She looked at me. I stepped closer. Not all the way. Just enough that we were talking to each other rather than across the room. Earlier, I said. When you said you wanted tonight to be the night you said it. She nodded. Did you say it? I asked. Or did you say the thing just before it? She thought about this for a second. The kind of thinking she did where she was actually arriving somewhere, not stalling. I said the thing just before it. She said. Okay, so, she said. So. I said. She looked at me the way she'd looked at that first photograph on the wall, like something she'd seen 100 times that was still managing to surprise her. I don't want to keep calling you my neighbor, she said. That would be fine with me. And I don't want to keep having Thursday dinners where I pretend I'm not watching the way you laugh, when something actually catches you off guard, like you don't know your face does that. I didn't say anything. And I don't want to spend another winter being 4 doors away from you and telling myself that's enough when I already know it isn't. She stopped. Took a breath. That's the thing. That's the whole thing. 3 years of Thursday dinners and borrowed parking spots and conversations that went longer than they had any reason to. 3 years of her showing up at my door and me opening it before she'd finished knocking, and neither of us saying what that meant. I know, I said. I've known for a while. Then, why didn't you say anything, she said, and it wasn't quite in curiosity. More like genuine curiosity. Because you were in something, I said. And then you were getting out of it. And in between there was a show you'd been building for 2 years, and I wasn't going to be the thing that complicated that. She looked at me for a long moment. She looked at me for a long moment. That is the most considerate, and also the most frustrating thing you've ever said to me, she said. I have a lot of those. She took 1 step toward me. Then stopped. Raid, yeah. I'm going to be honest about something, Okay. I'm scared, she said, not of this. Of what happens if this goes the way things go and then I lose the version of you I already have. The one I know I can count on. I thought about that for a second. She deserved a real answer. Not just reassurance. I don't think that version goes anywhere, I said. I think it just gets a different name, same as the photographs. She looked at me. What do you mean? You told me once that you don't change what you see when you develop a print. You just make it possible to see what was already there. She stared at me. I'm not applying your metaphors to my own life. I said. You absolutely are. It seemed relevant. She laughed. Small and real, the kind she didn't plan. She put her hand over her mouth like she was trying to keep it in and couldn't quite manage. And then she looked at me from above, her hand, with her eyes doing that thing they did, and she put her hand down, and she said, "Come here." I kissed her in the empty gallery, with the alarm code on the doorframe and the last 3 sold prints on the walls and the city moving quietly outside like it hadn't noticed anything important. Had just shifted. It didn't feel sudden. It felt like something that had been developing in the dark for a long time, and we had finally turned on the light. She kissed me back like she'd been making up her mind for years, and had finally stopped arguing with herself. One hand came to the front of my jacket. I put mine at her shoulder, steady, not going anywhere. When we pulled apart, she kept her forehead close to mine. I should have said something 8 months ago, she said. You said it tonight. Preston was already wrong by then. I know. Did you know? I had a theory. She leaned back just enough to look at me. You had a theory. I didn't want to influence the data. She made a sound that was mostly exasperation and a little bit fond. You are impossible, she said. You've told me that before. And I've always meant it affectionately. I know that too. She looked around the gallery. Her work on every wall, quiet and present and real. Outside, Queen West was doing what it always did on a Friday. Taxis, voices, the distant bass from somewhere that was only just getting started. In here, it was just us and the photographs. And 3 years of Thursday dinners that had always meant something, even when we were careful not to say it out loud. I drove her home just after 11. The gardener was clear for once, which felt like a small gift from the city. She sat with her shoes in her lap and her head resting against the window. And we talked about nothing important. The best print in the show. And whether the Arts Council rep had actually understood the sequence or just liked the framing. And what we were going to do with all the adrenaline, now that there was nowhere for it to go. Her hand found mine somewhere on Lakeshore. She didn't say anything, she just left it there, warm against mine, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Which I thought, it kind of was. I walked her up to her floor, same as I had 100 times before. Same elevator with the slow door. Same hallway with the weak overhead light that her building had been promising to replace since the previous March. Same chipped tile outside her neighbor's door. At her apartment, she turned her key in the lock and then stopped with her hand on the frame. Do you want to come in? She said. I have decent tea, and I'm not ready for tonight to be over. I thought about the Thursday dinners, the 7 a.m. conversation that had lasted until noon. The way she'd said you belong here in the gallery like she simply meant it. Yeah, I said. I want to come in. She opened the door. 6 weeks later, nobody on the 4th floor of our building pretended not to know. Mrs. Abrahamian from 4C said she'd been expecting it since the previous winter, and seemed personally satisfied. Bex texted Tessa a single photo of the first room print, the woman at the GO station, with the caption, "This one feels different now, and I can't explain it." The Arts Council rep came through with something, which Tessa told me about over Thursday dinner, with the particular quiet pleasure of someone who didn't celebrate out loud, but felt things deeply. She still borrowed my parking spot. I still showed up to her shoots when something went wrong and I could help move it in the right direction. We still argued about where to put things, and she was still usually right about the important ones, and I had started admitting that more often than I used to. Nothing felt new, exactly. It just felt like what it had always been, except that we'd finally stopped pretending the word. For it was anything other than what it was.